Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Maze Runner: The Scorch Trials. The Maze Runner films are kind of third in line in terms of prominence with the YA film adaptations. In some ways, that's a bad thing when you're watching them, and in other ways, it's actually a good thing. They're very good at showing you what's going on. They're also very good at doing exposition in a much more organic way. There's no voiceover going like, and they call themselves Maze Runners, and this group is called Douglas, and this is Section 13. In both the Hunger Games and in the Divergent films, there's always a part where someone goes, "What's this?" and someone just flat out explains it to you. In Maze Runner, if they even do that, they do it very quickly, so you're not really dwelling on it. And that's certainly something that makes this franchise work a lot better than I think, well, at least certainly the Divergent films, but makes it work a lot better than it probably should. Although it is third in line, so it has all the hallmarks of a very confined genre. More so the first one than this one. Do more with the second one and what fun you can kind of have with it, even though you're trying to hide the hallmarks and the problems with the genre itself, or the kind of book and the source material, and not being so beholden to it, but also kind of shows you the problems with that source material at the same time and how you can't entirely escape from it. This film takes place literally directly after the first Maze Runner film. I've noticed there's a lot of people I've talked to, and this isn't actually one person, it's several people who go, "What do you know about this Scorch Trials movie?" And I'm like, well, it's the sequel to the Maze Runner. It literally takes place directly after Maze Runner, so I don't think you should actually see this movie if you haven't seen the first Maze Runner. And there's no real character development, so you'd really seriously be lost without having watched the first Maze Runner. This very much works as a continuation in a saga, and I know tonight they were doing some screenings of playing Maze Runner, and then this one, that's probably the best way to see it, unless you know the first film very well. But they're basically dropped into this corporation who they think isn't wicked at first, and are being fed and kept in this bunker type situation, then realize it is the evil corporation, which is called Wicked, which stands for World Catastrophic Kill Zone Division. But anyway, so they realize they are being held by Wicked. All the kids who they think are being taken away and taken to a safe zone are being hung up and having things taken out of them. So then Thomas, or Dylan O'Brien, decides to get his friends and get them out of there, because that's all he cares about is his friends. He says it like he's kind of like a teenager and his family is going to go on a big family vacation. He's like, "No, I care about my friends, and this is the summer of senior year, man." He's a little selfish in that he only helps his friends out and a couple other people who are necessary to get them out of there. They escape and then go into the Scorch after solar flares hit the Earth, which, by the way, could realistically and scientifically happen at any time, so that should comfort you a bit. Doctor Who used to be really into it. They used to always have an episode that go, "What happened to the Earth? Solar flares." It could happen anytime. There's no way to detect it. It'll just happen. So solar flares did happen, and when solar flares just kind of messed up the whole world, this weird virus happened, and it made everyone these zombie things called cranks, which for some reason rip out their eyes, which I think is more for an effect thing, but whatever, they rip out their eyes, I don't know. And there are a lot of these weird zombie things in the Scorch, and they keep trying to find this resistance army to Wicked called the Right Hand. The names in this, oh my god. And they go and keep searching and eventually come across some people who can help them as they keep trying to get away from Wicked before Wicked can take them back and use them and hang them up so they can get the cure right from their blood. One of the things that comes very clear, especially when you're telling all the names of the various things in the Maze Runner films, it feels like your typical, young adult dystopian future novel, but with extra goofy names. It almost feels like this is the one that was published by Scholastic, that's available at the book fair, that's easy to understand for the younger kids before you can move on to Hunger Games and possibly Divergent if you want to, or whatever. You can read these. It's kind of like how you would read Spidey when you were learning how to read, and you'd eventually work your way up to Amazing Spider-Man. Everything's very simple. The Wicked thing, it sounds like something a 12-year-old would come up with. In Hunger Games and Divergent, they're kind of loose about like how this dystopian future got set up. They don't exactly go into detail. In this, they just kind of answer it outright. But then they have a lot of interesting and cool world building. I actually think this is one of the few films, there's a lot of talk about world building and how important it is and how interesting it can be. And I actually like the world building in this, but it kind of left you to believe that there was a lot more to go into. It didn't feel like, oh, we've done all the world building. Most of this film is honestly honestly world building. In some ways that can make it rather empty because you're not really having much character development at all. Thus why I think you'd really dislike this film if you hadn't seen The Maze Runner. It almost like really doesn't stand on its own, but it's kind of not meant to stand on its own, so you kind of have to make the argument of what this film actually is. I like it how it does world building, and you get that there's all this stuff that's happened, and since these kids don't have very much memory of what happened before or any context or really know what's been going on, they can discover these things, and that's a lot more interesting than the other films where you have all these people who know everything about what's going on in their society. Whereas in the Maze Runner films, we get to discover it with them, and I think that's a lot more interesting and a lot more fun. And the director, Wes Ball, is becoming a really interesting director. Both Divergent and Hunger Games switched directors when it came to the sequels. He's the first one to do this, and it's interesting he takes it in a much different direction. They don't like go into the maze again or a more crazier maze because obviously they have a bigger budget now, like Catching Fire, and they don't have a very simple explanation to their world building like Insurgent. This is totally different than all of that. Now it gets too into the world building, but he almost like kind of understands that there's not much there and they're going through a lot of story and a lot of ideas in this film, so he makes it at least exciting. They don't stick around for too long, and if they do, it eventually builds to more running and more chasing and more action sequences, which for the most part can be kind of cool. There was only one I seriously disliked, which was, believe it or not, a zombie chase. It was mostly because the way they used the flashlights in it, I was like, what is going on? It wasn't shaky cam, but because they're running around with these flashlights in the dark and these flashlights are strobing around all over the place, I did not know what was going on sometimes, and it wasn't very clear. But then other times, the way Wes Ball uses the camera, it's incredibly clear and it's incredibly cinematic, and so I was kind of disappointed in those sequences. I felt like he could do a lot better than how he did them. It felt like he was making something that was already exciting overly exciting, and by doing that he made it look like nonsense. But then he has a really cool zombie chase where they're going through that building that's leaning over and they go through glass and all this stuff, and they go in the sewers. It gets more and more interesting as it goes on. The end climax wasn't great, but he does a good job, and he kind of understands that this film doesn't have much of a backbone. The other film, the first Maze Runner, is kind of too much of a genre YA film. It's a little different, but it's very much in that genre. And this one, it's not really playing off of the first film. It's like going on a weirder, different tangent, but he kind of gets like he doesn't have that genre to go back on. He's literally like playing out in the wasteland in terms of like, there's really not another YA film like this. I can't really compare it to Catching Fire or Insurgent because it's really doing a different thing, but it's doing it in a very world-buildy, let's not go into the characters too much way that can feel a little emptier. It's kind of like a film only made for people who saw the first Maze Runner, which is kind of ballsy considering like it didn't really do that well. This is like maybe something it made more sense for Hunger Games to make, and it kind of almost, as it goes on and they get more and more into the Scorch, as it's called. I love it when Aidan Gillian or Carcetti on The Wire goes like, "You'll never survive in the Scorch." I love it when he says like, "the Scorch." It always makes me laugh. Even when I saw the movie, I laughed. I like how kind of old school sci-fi it is. There's one part where him and this newer girl have to go into this club, and like it's this crazy futuristic party, that Evil Island and Dumbo type of club, and like they have to get drunk to go in. It felt very 70s sci-fi, and he really goes into more of that kind of stuff than you'd expect. That's one of my other things about most dystopian things now, is they feel very 2015 dystopian. This felt like more classic sci-fi, where it's more into its sci-fi plot than it is talking about characters. Now the plot would be a lot more interesting, and this feels a lot more episodic. It almost felt like Wes Ball is like just trying to make a mostly kind of crap story and crap screenplay work a lot better cinematically, and at least work for the most part. And so he's just trying to not go into how much the script sucks and how it doesn't have a lot of character development by just making it fast paced and making all the energy kinetic, and just like not dwelling on pretty much nothing character development. The actors don't get to have as much fun. I think Dylan O'Brien made a bigger case for him being a movie star in the first one than this one, although I do quite like when he has to make a decision as the leader. You know, he's supposed to be the guy who has these crazy newfangled ideas. Everything changed when he showed up and all this nonsense. But every time he comes up with something, he kind of looks around like, that's a that's a good idea, right? I mean, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing this. And I kind of like that. He had a very teenage sense about him. Like, he was really confident in it, but part of him was like, I mean, I think so. But almost any time he made like a big declaration, you kind of look around like, right? And everyone would kind of doubt him, which I thought was cool. It is a little different from the other ones in that it's not them just fighting against a futuristic dystopian society. It's also them trying to survive and maybe finding the way that they believe in. They're not sure if it's the right one that they believe in, which is morally, I think, is a little more interesting. This isn't a great story. The YA thing is interesting. You know, it was start with the Twilight thing, and no one could really make a second franchise out of that. But for whatever reason, when Hunger Games happened, we have 3 franchises going on at once and 2 kind of rip-off Hunger Games franchises all at the same time, which is a bizarre circumstance. The thing with the genre is it's so kind of simplistic, and it does kind of feel like Baby's first book or something, and this is Baby's first dystopian future movie, and it's really not that complex. But I think the difference between these films and the other ones is like they kind of get it and just don't really act like this is bigger than it is, and kind of try to make it at least entertaining and fun. A lot of what YA sequels do is they kind of make up for all the complaints of the first film, and this one didn't really feel like that. That's kind of what makes it a unique sequel, is because no one was like looking at the Maze Runner and really had that many problems with it. A lot of people kind of liked it, and I think it was actually fairly solid for whatever it was, but it's still hindered by its own genre. And I think that's kind of the problem too, is as much as Westball tries to do something different with it, it's still hindered by this genre that's not that interesting. You're not going to really get into the complexities and all the horror or atrocities that would probably happen with a dystopian thing. You're just going to focus on this simpler conflict, so it's easier to take down. And maybe, you know, the problem is that I'm not the right demographic for this franchise. And yeah, that's definitely true. But I think it's also that this isn't a great genre in itself. Certainly, I think Hunger Games has appealed to people outside of its target demographic, and that's what made it so huge. But they're not the kind of genre that when we look back at this era in film, we'll go, well, those were popular, but we're not going to talk about how those said very much. These YA dystopian things are mostly kind of forgettable studio things that a studio can kind of check off. It might have cool imagery, and maybe Westball will go somewhere at some point, and same with Dylan O'Brien. Maze Runner, the Scorch Trials kind of just makes me think that these will probably be regulated to the past, and justifiably so, because it's just kind of a genre that's too tempered down by simplistic and stupid ideas to really be anything more than the genre it is, and that's frankly not impressive enough, no matter how well you direct it. So if you have seen Maze Runner, The Scorch Trials, and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. I forgot to mention, there's one part where Dylan O'Brien was like, why are we stopping? He goes, because I'm tired of running. I was hard not to laugh. Oh, Maze Runner. And what are you doing?